Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am delighted to introduce this virtual event with Alex Keyssaar presenting his new book, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?, in conversation with Miles Rapoport. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. Just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we will get through as many questions as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help to ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. We thank you so much for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings recently, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Alex Keyssaar is the author of numerous books, including The Right to Vote, which was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and won the Beveridge Award from the American Historical Association. He is Matthew W. Stirling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Miles Rapoport is Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and is a longtime organizer, policy advocate, and elected official. Prior to his appointment to the Ash Center, he was most recently president of the independent grassroots organization Common Cause. For 13 years, he headed the Public Policy Center Demos, and previously served as Connecticut's Secretary of State. Tonight, they will be discussing Alex's new book, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?, in which he explains the persistence of this arcane institution that chooses the American president. He examines the history of the Electoral College, the failed attempts to reform or abolish it, and why efforts for reform have received so little attention from Congress for the last 40 years. Lawrence Lessig praises this is a brilliant contribution to a critical current debate, just in time to help guide effective reform. And now I'm honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Alexander and Miles.
Thank you, Nell.
Thank you, Nell. And let me say thank you, and also thank the Harvard Bookstore for making this possible tonight. Thanks to all of you who are joining us tonight. I think it'll be a really good discussion. And especially thanks to Alex Keyssaar for writing this remarkable book. I'll just say that I've been a friend and a fan of Professor Keyssaar's work for years. We have both been involved in the democracy reform field, trying to make a democracy that is inclusive for everyone and a fair playing field. The Right to Vote, his previous book that Nell referenced, has been sort of the anchor and really the framer, if I can use that term, for the field's understanding of the nation's troubled and fraught history about the right to vote. This book, I believe, and I'll show you the book, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College, will have the same role, I think, as kind of the anchor explanation of the history, practice, and possibilities for change for the Electoral College. I have to say, speaking of the book, the timing is everything, and this book is perfectly timed. I would say there's more interest in the issues of how we do our democracy than ever before, and I've been in this field for a good 35 years. We are facing more challenges to our democratic structures than ever. And at the same time, I think there is more interest and more energy for democracy reform than I've ever seen as well. Just quickly, I think there are two kinds of challenges. One are the kind of immediate challenges that we're facing in this incredibly turbulent moment. Just for an example, President of the United States who decides he wants to postpone the election because maybe it will be problematical, or states that are trying to make it really difficult for people to vote, whether by mail or in person, or just the obvious issue of trying to figure out how to do an election under the conditions of a serious pandemic. So those are the kind of the current issues, but there are also long-term structural issues that have been with us for a long time. How we vote. Is voting a civil right, or should we think of it as a civic duty? What about the campaign finance system, which has tilted the playing field towards the wealthy for many, many, many years? What about the undemocratic nature of the US Senate? I think we're rapidly approaching a point where 70% of the people will have 30% of the senators, and 30% of the people will have 70% of the senators. But topping the entire list, heading the pack, so to speak, of structural problems is the Electoral College. The Electoral College gives some states major advantages and undervalues the votes of other states. It narrows the election to a small number of so-called battleground states. And lastly, in 2 elections already in the 21st century out of 5, for the mathematicians here, that's 40% of the elections, the Electoral College has delivered the presidency to someone who has lost the popular vote. So that seems like a pretty serious indictment of this long-standing institution, which leads exactly to the question of why do we still have the Electoral College? So since Alex has been kind of a person who has taken on these big issues for his whole career, let me ask you, Alex, what motivated you to really dig in here and write this book?
Thanks, Miles. Before addressing that question, let me thank you for the generous introduction and thoughtful introduction. And let me also thank the Harvard Bookstore for sponsoring this event. I'm very grateful that they have done so. In terms of what led me to write the book, I think it happened in 2 stages. The first stage was simply the 2000 election, when the person who won the most votes did not become president. And that set off questions in my mind, as in everyone's. They're like, well, why did we do it like this? And then what happened, then there was a second stage, which took a number of years, which was, I began reading around, looking around, trying to understand the history of the institution, and I came across a number of facts that seemed to magnify the puzzle. One was the fact that there were 800 to 900 constitutional amendments introduced into Congress to modify or get rid of the Electoral College. By someone's estimate, 10% of all constitutional amendments in the last several hundred years have been about the Electoral College. So there's been longstanding interest. And I also discovered that on 6 occasions, one branch of Congress actually approved a constitutional amendment by the requisite 2/3 vote. So that interested me and surprised me. I also learned that public opinion polls indicated that the American people have overwhelmingly favored a national popular vote since there have been opinion polls, which starts in the 1940s. Now, admittedly, that took a dip after the 2016 election, when Republicans suddenly went from being in favor of Electoral College reform by a margin of about 58%, or 58% favored reform, and 2 weeks later, only 19% were in favor of reform. But I think that may creep back up. But the basic fact was that public opinion had favored this. So we have this long history of dysfunction, attempted reforms, public opinion. And then the final thing which really got me going was uncovering, I thought, it took me a while to fully figure this out, that the conventional answer to the question, the longstanding conventional answer, which is, well, we don't have Electoral College reform because of the small states. The small states get an extra increment electoral votes, and thus they don't want to get rid of it by having a national popular vote. It turns out that's not true. It's a convenient answer to disguise some things that are maybe a little bit less principled looking. So with all of those discoveries, it presented a puzzle to me. You know, why do we have it? And it became a scholarly inquiry that I think also mirrors a question that a couple of 100 million Americans ask themselves every 4 years, which is, why do we elect presidents this way?
Well, let's take us back. You're a historian, so let's go back actually to the Constitutional Convention, which, you know, whose deliberations have taken on an aura of sanctity. And you would think that how the selection of president took place would be the subject of a lot of deep and thorough thinking, but from the book, it seems like that's not quite the case. So why don't you tell us how the Electoral College came to be back at the Constitutional Convention?
Sure. No, it's exactly right. They were befuddled by the question of how to choose a chief executive. In the Articles of Confederation, which is what predated the Constitution, there was no separate executive branch, and they didn't really have models to do this. When the convention convened in Philadelphia in 1787, the default option, which most people seem to favor, sort of, was that Congress would choose the president. And on several occasions in the course of the summer, they had straw votes, and a majority, or sort of a majority, said yes, Congress should choose the president. And then then the next day or a couple of days later, they would start saying, no, that's really not a good idea, because then we don't have separation of powers and we're going to have corruption. And they went around and around. They talked about having a national popular vote. They talked about governors choosing the president. They could not come to a resolution. And then we're now into late August, and they still don't have an answer. Philadelphia in August is very hot than it was that summer. They were tired, under pressure, so they did what convening bodies often do. They went on vacation and left a committee back in Philadelphia to try to iron out the, quotes, unfinished parts. And that committee, which consisted of 11 people, one from each state, was a group that came up with the Electoral College. And there are many factors that contribute to it, but I think that the best way to understand what they came up with was that it was building on this default notion that Congress should choose the president, but no, that could be corrupt. The best way to understand it is that what the Electoral College is a replica of Congress. It has the same value, the same number of representatives and senators from each state, the same number of votes. Each state's weight is the same as it is in Congress. It's a replica of Congress that performs only one function and then disbands, and thus it can't be corrupted. And that's how they came up with it.
Wow, interesting. And you said, by the way, that the small state versus big state was not the only issue. Let me ask you, at the moment in this country, we are realizing just how many things need to be reviewed or looked at anew through the lens of racism and structural racism and slavery. And so I'm guessing that looked at with that perspective, there are a lot of things that come up about the Electoral College. So how do you think it looks when you think about it? And what impact did the issue of race and racism have on the Electoral College?
The impact is enormous. Now, that's not to say there is this disagreement among historians, but I'm not one of those who would claim that the institution was created to protect slaveholders. I don't think that's true. The 3/5 clause, which was already in the compromises over representation, was imported into the allocation of Electoral College votes, but it wasn't the reason for it. But certainly during the first half of the 19th century, there could be no possible consideration of a national popular vote because the South would veto it. But the most powerful story about the impact of race on Electoral College reform comes from about the 1880s into the 1970s. And, you know, the core fact there is that Southern politicians were almost uniformly and firmly and ferociously opposed to a national popular vote. Why? Well, I mean, the 3/5 clause was gone. African Americans were enfranchised for a brief time, but then they were disenfranchised. At that point, Southern whites benefited from what I've called the 5/5 clause. In effect, Southern states got representation in Congress and electoral votes in proportion to the state's entire population, white and black, but only whites were permitted to vote. This gave greatly disproportionate influence to Southern whites. And they feared, and I think feared rightly, that if the country adopted a national popular vote, they would surrender a great deal of that influence. They feared two things. One was that it would put pressure on them to enfranchise African Americans, which they did not want to do. And then the second was that it would diminish their clout because, you know, in the Electoral College, to take a slightly different angle on this, or state it in a slightly different way. In the Electoral College, the influence of a state depends on its population. In the national popular vote, the influence of a state depends on how many people turn out to vote. And those Southern whites benefited from it, and they basically kept the idea of a national popular vote off the table for many years. And then, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, they derailed the episode when we came closest to getting rid of the Electoral College vote. And I can talk about this if people are interested in the question here, but there are many other episodes too, and other dynamics in which race plays a role. In almost all of the significant episodes of Electoral College reform since the Civil War, race plays a key role.
So you mentioned actually a number of efforts of reform. A major kind of theme of the book is just how many different reforms there were. So obviously, if you reviewed all of them, we'd be here until Sunday morning. But why don't you pick a few examples of times when reform was a serious option and tell us what happened?
Sure. I'm chagrined that you can't stay till Sunday morning, but let me pick two examples. One has to do with state reform and the other has to do with federal reform. There is one reform that states can undertake by themselves with the Electoral College, which is that they can get rid of winner take all. Winner take all is not in the Constitution. The states have retained the power to decide how their electoral votes will be allocated, and they didn't all use winner take all at the outset. By the 1830s, it becomes pretty much the rule. What happens at the end of the 19th century is this extraordinary episode that takes place in Michigan, which had been a Republican-dominated, Republican majority state. Like most states in the Midwest, it tended to go 55-45 Republican. But the Democrats gained control of the state legislature at one point in the 1890, 1891. And one of the first things they did was to end winner take all in the Electoral College, and to create a district system, so that if you won if you won a district, you got that electoral vote, and it would basically split the electoral votes of the state. And it's an age-old proposal. James Madison in the 1820s was in favor of it. Jefferson was in favor of it, and notably, it had been the preferred sort of option among Republicans in Congress in the 1870s. So this happens in 1891 in Michigan. And what happens is that then the entire Republican establishment in Michigan and in the country turns against this. They denounce this reform. It's called the Minor Law, after John Minor, who was a very minor figure in history. And they denounce this law as a crime against democracy. The President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison, gets involved and starts crusading against it. They fight it in the courts. They lose in the Michigan. They argue that you can only use winner take all. They lose that in the Michigan courts. Then they take it to the federal courts. They end up having an emergency convening of the United States Supreme Court just before the 1892 election to fight over this issue, and to saying that you can't allow district elections. And the question which occurred, one comment to make about this story, which ties into the previous theme, is I wondered why. I'm wondering why these Republicans who favored district elections in 1877 treated them like the plague, pardon the expression, in the 1890s. The answer was that in the intervening 20 years, basically, or 15 years, the South had become 100% solidly Democratic, and had in effect banished Republicans as well as African Americans. So that if district systems were created, there would be no gains for the Republicans in the South, but they would probably lose about 40 to 45% of the electoral votes that they earned in the North. And the conclusion of the Republican Party was that they would never again win a presidential election. So that's one episode having to do with, and then what happens in Michigan is this: the Republicans come back into power, and they're still so enraged about this attempted reform that they punish the Democrats, gerrymander them, pass all sorts of voter suppression laws aimed at immigrant workers who are voting Democratic, and they remain solidly in power in Michigan for the next 50 years. Democrats don't come near power until the New Deal. Second episode may seem substantially less remote to us. This takes place in the 1960s. And for various reasons having to do with, I think, sincere commitments to democratic values, but also having to do with the fear of George Wallace becoming a kingmaker in elections, support for a national popular vote, for jettisoning the Electoral College completely and coming up with a national popular vote. Support grows tremendously in the course of the 1960s, both popular support and elite support. The American Bar Association, the Chamber of Commerce, as well as the AFL-CIO. I mean, those three organizations agreeing on anything is unlikely. They all favored Electoral College reform. In 1969, the House passes a constitutional amendment to reform the to abolish the Electoral College and replace it with the national vote by more than an 80% margin. One thing I found interesting, and as we've alluded to, Miles and I have known each other for a long time, but in that period when I was in my early 20s, I was focused on the anti-war movement. I had no idea that this was happening in Congress. And I think that very few people know about this episode. In any case, the House passes an amendment, and then it goes to the Senate. And there's a lot of momentum. If you look at the newspapers in October of 1969, they think this is going to happen. Momentum seems overwhelming. It goes to the Senate, where key Southern senators slow it down. It has to go through the Judiciary Committee, which is chaired by segregationist Senator James Eastland of Mississippi. He slows the thing down and sort of creates delay after delay. The year in Congress of 1969, the spring of 1970, is a year that is filled with regional tensions. Two Southerners are nominated to the Supreme Court, and they are both rejected by the Senate. And then there is a bitter battle over renewal of the Voting Rights Act. So the issues of race and region are paramount in this period. Eventually, thanks to the machinations of Indiana Senator Birch Bayh, the amendment does reach the Senate floor in September of 1970. And there it is greeted by a filibuster led by Strom Thurmond, Sam Ervin, and other Southerners, with a couple of Midwestern Republicans thrown in. we could talk later, but the strategy of using a filibuster, which required a 2/3 vote to override at that point, was odd, because to approve an amendment, you also needed a 2/3 vote. But the Southerners basically wanted to get 2 chances to block it. They did block it. The advocates of reform never reached the 2/3 mark in the Senate. The vote was heavily regional. 78%, I think it is, of senators from outside the South voted in favor of reform or foreclosure, and a similar percentage of Southern senators voted against. And that was the time in the 20th century when we came closest, and in effect, it was killed by a Southern filibuster. Sorry to have gone on so long, but it's a big story.
Absolutely goes back to the point we were talking about before, about how race, was critical in that. The filibuster wasn't for show. Well, speaking of reform, so there is now discussion again of Electoral College Reform. We don't know exactly what impact it will have in the 2020 elections. I'll come back and ask you that in a few minutes. But, there is a movement for a national popular vote, for an interstate compact. There are other proposals. So what's your general sense about, A, the possibilities of reform and what form that reform might take if it were to come about?
Well, look, I couldn't have written this long book about the defeats and ended up as simply a sort of a blind-eyed optimist. But I do think that the possibilities of reform are realistic. Not this week, not next month, but I think in the next few years, or within the next decade. But let me try to return to that. But I want to make a couple of comments about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And there's no way to tell how many people in the audience know what it is. But it's, in brief, it's a compact that a state can join the compact, saying that it will cast all of its electoral votes for the candidate who wins the national popular vote. Not for the candidate who wins their state, but the candidate who wins the national popular vote. This compact will take effect when states that have a total of 270 electoral votes, which is a majority, have signed on to it. The 15 states in the District of Columbia have now signed on to it. They're only about 75 votes short of winning. I think it's important to contextualize where the compact came from. It was a response to it originated formally in 2006, but it was a response to the 2000 election and to the fact that Republican opposition to reform in Congress, which has been staunch since 1980. There was a shift in the Republican Party. In the 1960s, the Republican Party the whole movement was bipartisan. But since the early 1980s, that has not been true. There seemed to be no way in the world to get a constitutional amendment through Congress, and the compact idea is a way to circumvent that constitutional process. It's an ingenious idea or cluster of ideas, and it's been very energetically and impressively organized. My own view is that I think that if the compact comes close to succeeding, its best strategy would be to then convert itself into a movement for a constitutional amendment. I think that there are numerous legal issues. I mean, if the compact were ever to go into effect and be used in an election, every lawyer in the United States would have work to do dealing with the lawsuits that would arise out of it. And I worry also that the compact is inherently unstable. But I think there are new constitutional amendments that have been introduced into Congress, within the last 6 months, and I think that the combination of grassroots, outside movement, democratic energy, and perhaps a reconfigured Congress will create the possibilities for progress on this.
Great. All right, I'm going to ask you another question, but I want to do a quick reminder to the audience that if you have a question that you want to ask Professor Keyssaar, go right ahead, and Nell is going to come on in a couple of minutes and broker the questions for us. So the one thing everybody knows about thinking about the 2020 elections is that whatever you think about it today will be completely different 2 weeks hence. That said, obviously in 2016, we had an election where Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by 3 million votes and yet lost the Electoral College and, significantly. One could imagine a situation in 2020 where, the Democratic nominee won by 5 million votes and still lost in the Electoral College. So as you've been looking at this while studying the Electoral College, what's your sense of what impact it might play in the 2020 elections? And after that, we'll go to questions from the audience.
Well, building on your comment, Miles, I think that an unspoken but important truth as we look at the 2020 election is that there would be relatively little concern or mystery about the outcome if we had a national popular vote. The outcome seems to be in doubt only because of the Electoral College. I don't think anyone thinks that Donald Trump is likely to win the popular vote against Joe Biden. Now, we could be wrong. We're still several months out, but so it's only the Electoral College which seems to be making this into a somewhat competitive race, and even then, it might not be. The Electoral College is affecting all of the strategies, all the campaign strategies on both sides, and that's, to my mind, one of its deforming features. The Electoral College was winner take all, so that doesn't matter by how much you win New York or California or Texas. It just matters that you win. The Electoral College and the structure of winner take all, perversely, but maybe not perversely, but it provides an incentive for voter suppression, right? If you are in a state that's close or sort of close, if you can suppress 2 or 3% of the vote, that may not produce a marginal increase of 2 to 3% in your total votes. It could give you all of the state's electoral votes, so that there is an incentive to suppress votes under the Electoral College. The final thing that concerns me among the many scenarios that have been circulating in recent days and weeks and months about whether this election will happen or whether it will proceed to a normal finale of counting the votes and declaring who wins. I worry about the provision in the Constitution which says that electors can be chosen in the manner that each state legislature can decide. They can choose the manner, they can have it, which means, among other things, they do not have to have a popular election. And they can cancel a popular election even when it's scheduled, and they can override, if they have reasons, the results of a popular election. This almost happened in Florida in 2000 when the Republican legislature was prepared to choose its own electors if the court cases did not work out that well enough. I'm worried that this could happen in this election in Florida and North Carolina or in Wisconsin, where confusions about the count of the election become a rationale for a Republican legislature to choose its own electors. So I hope that's not true, but the Electoral College is really right there. That's the structure is shaping this election.
And hopefully we'll give some more impetus for reform afterwards. That would be what we hope. All right, Neil, are you there? Come on.
Hi.
And have a question. Thank you for coming back. Do you have a question from the audience for us?
Absolutely. So yeah, we have a good batch of questions here. So first up, it's my understanding that Nebraska's popular votes are still proportioned for the Electoral College vote. Why don't more states do this?
It's a good question. Nebraska does use a district system. It's not quite proportional. It uses a district system, as does Maine. the shorthand answer to why more states don't do it, there are two answers. One is that if a state has a dominant political party, it generally doesn't want to do that because it would mean giving up electoral votes. And they were able to circumvent that in Nebraska, where the Republican Party has been dominant. They were able to circumvent that in a peculiar way. But so one reason is that if you have a dominant party. The other reason is that states, from the viewpoint of people in states switching, that the state will lose clout if it moves to a district system rather than winner take all. And even though everybody might agree that districts would be better, or a proportional system even better, because it avoids the problem of gerrymandering, that even though that would be better, nobody wants to go first. Nobody wants to give up their clout first. So I think that has been the core problem. You know, in 2007-8, the legislature of North Carolina, which was Democratic at the time, was poised to institute district elections. And they were about to do it. They had the votes when suddenly the National Democratic Party went to them and said, we don't want you to do this. Well, why don't we want you to do this? Because there was a simultaneous movement in California by Republicans to institute a district system, which might have won Republicans 22 electoral votes in California. So the Democratic Party said, well, we want to be consistent. We can't be arguing for this in North Carolina against it in California. So that's a summary of the reasons.
Well, just to add a quick comment, which is that's one of the reasons why the National Popular Vote Compact is designed the way it is. The problem of, no state wants to go first. So it's designed such that we'll all go, if we all go together, none of us will go without it. So there's some logic in that as well, obviously.
Okay.
Nell?
And next question, why do we not have a national nonpartisan body to draw up electoral district maps, given the discriminatory and recently ruled illegal gerrymandering by Republican-governed states in all of the presidential, quote, swing states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida? He lists as examples.
Well, Miles may have a better answer than I do. The answer that I would give about this is that the reason we do not have such a body is because we have such a law would have to be passed by Congress, which is run by people from these gerrymandered districts and conservative districts who precisely don't want to do that. I mean, there are the problem of gerrymandering is immense, and or districting is immense, and it's a partisan issue. And won't be solved unless there's a change in the partisan composition of Congress.
Next.
I'll add two quick things, and that is that, that when the Help America Vote Act was passed in 2002, to kind of help out after the Florida debacle, they created the Election Assistance Commission, and the states completely resisted the idea of giving any central authority, any central body, any federal body, any authority. So they didn't even call it the election agency. They called it the Election Assistance Commission, denoting the weakness even in its thing. I do feel that there has been some real interesting progress over the last 10 years since the post-Tea Party wave, gerrymandering. And I think a lot of the states will actually, either because they have a nonpartisan redistricting commission, or because of partisan changes, or because of ballot initiatives, I think the redistricting process will be actually much closer to being nonpartisan in 2020, 21, and 2022 than it has been up until now. I'm sort of an optimist on that front.
And we have from Devin, what caused the tectonic shift within the Republican Party so that by 1980 they were so against Electoral College Reform compared to their bipartisan support for it in the 1960s?
It's a very good question, and I would say a couple of different things happened. One was that the Republicans who were in office in the 1980s there were a significant number of them who were a different breed of Republican than had been around in the 1960s. I mean, again, 1980 is a good symbolic year. It's the year that Ronald Reagan, was elected. And notably, Ronald Reagan was ferociously opposed to Electoral College Reform and a national popular vote when it came up in the 1970s. In contrast to Gerald Ford and Bob Dole, who favored Electoral College Reform. So that you really see the very conservative wing of the Republican Party, and also, let's face it, that conservative wing of the Republican Party is also increasingly a Southern party, and a party influenced by the South. But then what happens? I mean, that's sort of with the first phases of the shift. But then by the mid-1980s, even the early 1980s, there is widespread talk, usually sub rosa, about there existing something called the, quotes, Republican lock on the Electoral College. So no, it wasn't quite a lock, but that it advantaged them. They won 3 presidential elections in a row, based on that. But the core notion, and it's interesting, was demographic. Their view was that the states that were growing most rapidly, which were in the South and parts of the Southwest, were the states that were also Republican. And thus those states would gain electoral votes, while the traditionally liberal areas would lose electoral votes. And the Republican Party has clung to that conviction. And of course, the 2000 election, also affirmed the notion that there were, as did the 2016 election, that the Electoral College advantages Republicans. The fact that we came very close to a reverse dynamic in 2004, when John Kerry almost became president despite losing the popular vote, doesn't seem to have fazed Republican thinkers at all.
And we have, to what degree is Electoral College reform being resisted by small population rural states who do not have the population to influence national popular vote results?
I think that, based on my research, I can't tell you exactly everything going on this minute, but there are rural conservative states and rural progressive states. I spend a lot of time in Vermont, which is a small population state. I haven't taken a poll of Vermonters, but I'm quite certain that the state of Bernie Sanders would be in favor of Electoral College reform. Other places out in the Midwest might be different. I think that even in some of these smaller rural areas, like Utah, for example, came very close to joining the compact. So far, no solidly Republican states have joined the compact, but it looked like Utah was maybe going to do it. So that, I think there's a fear that we're from rural states with less population, we will get swamped by the popular votes of the big, the most populous states. But as one senator, I forget who it was, said in the 1970s, when he was from a small rural state, he said, it's hardly any different than it is now with winner take all and the Electoral College. I mean, we don't have much clout anyway.
Right. And we have our next question from Catherine. Thanks for the talk. Can't wait to read the book, which I just purchased. My question today, what is the most effective tactic or political activity people who want to work for the end of the Electoral College should adopt?
Wow. Well, thank you for buying the book, and I hope everybody sitting near you does that too. This is a little conventional and unimaginative, but I would think that the best tactic would be to try to elect into office, either in your legislature, to make it an issue in your legislature or in congressional elections, people who share that opinion. And then there may be other sort of popular organizing to do around that as well, even perhaps maybe around the events in November. I mean, there are meetings. The Electoral College isn't an entity, actually, and the name isn't in the Constitution, but the Electoral College of each state meets it will meet in December in every state, possibly demonstrations. I don't know. Miles, you're a much more experienced organizer than I am. What would you say to that question?
Well, I mean, I think that if the Electoral College is in the middle of whatever tough controversy takes place in and around the election, I think the first step is that, to give the issue much more visibility. And then I do think that either if there are changes, political changes, there certainly are demographic changes, but if there are political changes in a number of states, you could get the interstate compact closer. And it's an interesting strategy that you suggested, Alex, which is if it gets really, really close, then, kind of potentially shift into a constitutional amendment strategy. But I think you're right. I think it's electing people who care about reform. My guess is that people who care about general democratic reform in terms of voting and campaign finance will also, or ending the filibuster, will also be in favor of Electoral College reform. So I think it's a matter of electing people who will support it and then taking whatever energy there is around it in November into the 2021 political debates.
And here is a question about faithless electors. So is the issue of faithless electors significant in electoral votes? What do you think of the recent decision about faithless electors?
An inevitable question. Look, historically and over time, the issue of faithless electors has not been very significant. They've never determined the outcome of an election and never really come close. Interesting, going back to our theme about race in the South, the second half, from the 1940s on, faithless electors regained a kind of prominence because there were a lot of Southern faithless electors who did not want to vote for the candidate of the Democratic Party, even though they themselves were Democrats.
Right.
I don't think it's a big issue. As to the Supreme Court decision, I supported Larry Lessig's position on this, and just as an historian, I would have to say that I find it difficult to believe that justices, particularly those who see themselves as originalists, could not recognize that the Constitution intended sort of electors to have the ability to debate, to consult their own wisdom, and to make their own decisions. That they ought to be independent. And I think the rationales of the court, I thought, were pretty weak for overcoming that. They seem to be intent on a strategy of averting chaos, as I think it was Justice Kavanaugh was talking about during the oral arguments. But I think they opted for one kind of chaos as opposed to another. But in the end, I don't think the decision is going to matter much.
Mm-hmm. And Miles, I want to be cognizant of the time. Yeah. I think we have time. Okay, so I'm going to look through these for one last question, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you, Miles. And let's see here. I have a bunch of questions. Let's see here. Oh, okay, here, this is interesting. Someone asks, what would presidential campaigning look like if we switch to a national popular vote system versus the current focus by campaigns on, quote, battleground states? That kind of encompasses a few of the questions I got.
It's a great question.
It's a very good question, and the answer is I don't know, and nobody else does exactly either. I mean, no, that's it's true. It would look very different. I mean, there's opponents fear that everything would be concentrated in the large media markets. But, it's also true that, that a vote is a vote no matter where you pick it up. And there will be strategies to pick up, all sorts of, votes in all sorts of places. And a little bit back, if one remembers, it's a slightly different context, but in the 2008 primary season, Barack Obama concentrated on picking up pledged delegates to the convention in all sorts of unlikely and small places, but they began to add up. So I think it would be new rules. I think that it would certainly be an election in which we were all being addressed by the candidates. The messaging would be different. Not only how it was packaged, where it was shown, but those of us who were in Massachusetts, there is no presidential election campaign. It's something that's happening someplace else. And that would cease to be true. I mean, it would become, for example, you think in your own neighborhood, well, it become important to turn out people for your candidate. Even if you know that they're going to win Massachusetts, how big they win by would matter. So it's an unknown, and changing systems have unforeseen consequences. But my own bet is that on balance, the consequences will be beneficial.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to do 3 quick last things before we go, and thank everybody. And Nell, thank you. One is to make another pitch for the book. Here it is. I can't say that I've read absolutely all of it, but I've read a good chunk of it, and it is fascinating. There are all kinds of stories in it. So I want to just encourage you again. Which leads me to my second question, which is, Alex, to give you a chance to, if there's a story you feel like telling that you think was really interesting at some point in the history here, other than what you've already said, I want to give you a chance to tell it. And then I want to come back and have you close by saying, what do you want the takeaway for people who are in the audience to be about the Electoral College and its significance and its future?
Okay, well, the story, I guess, and it's a weird story, is a story from the late 1940s and 1950, when there's a movement in Congress to pass a constitutional amendment to require the allocation of electors proportionally. And it is sponsored by Henry Cabot Lodge in the Senate, Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, who was a liberal Republican. And he really believed in a national popular vote, but he thought that this had some possibilities. And he didn't think he could get a national popular vote. And he also wanted to help the Republican Party maybe make some inroads in the South. That was what he was there for. His co-sponsor was a guy named Ed Lee Gossett, who was a very right-wing congressman from Texas. And Gossett's argument was very different. He wanted to have a proportional system, and he gave speeches on the floor of Congress about this, because he wanted to limit the power of Jews, blacks, and Italians in New York State, whom he thought were in effect determining American presidential elections. Basically, he wanted to break up the power of large states. And he gave these extraordinary speeches about how the communists, the New York Labor Party, and then, and then the Jews, the Italians, and black people, that they, remarkably, this amendment gets passed by the Senate in 1950. They were asleep at the switch. In some of the liberals were asleep at the switch about what was going on here. And then after it gets passed, they start paying attention. It's an interesting lesson in people in one branch of Congress not paying attention to the other, or thinking only superficially. And then liberal members of Congress, coupled with some important outside African-American advisors, recognize that what this is really aimed at, from Gossett's point of view, is killing the civil rights movement and killing Northern support for the civil rights movement. by diminishing the power of key northern states, and in effect making the South the strongest wing of the Democratic Party. So in a period of 6 weeks, this whole thing kind of turns around. It's a remarkable political moment where you go from a constitutional amendment that is passed by a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and 6 weeks later, 7 weeks later maybe, it is voted down by about a 2/3 vote in the House of Representatives. So that's my last story. But the anti-communism, the racism, all that feeding into this tells something about the anxiety attached to our politics and our discussions of political institutions.
Great. All right. And how about your when my father wanted my mother to leave a party? She was always the last one to leave. He would go up to her and say, "Florence, make your concluding remarks." So, Alex, make your concluding remarks here.
Well, for one thing, I want to thank everybody for staying with us, and for participating or listening to this session. I think that, the final things I want to say in terms of the question that I ask in the book, why do we still have the Electoral College? But there are multiple factors. It's hard to amend the Constitution. Partisanship in some periods has played a role. It's played a very big role, but not at all periods. Racial tensions and racial conflict have played a major role, mostly not in a very positive or progressive direction. And also something we don't quite recognize, which is that the intricacies of the institution are such to make reform difficult. I'll give one final example there at the risk of trying everyone's patience. An aspect of the Electoral College we haven't talked about is the contingent election system. This is in the Constitution. This is what happens if nobody wins a majority of the electoral votes. And the Constitution says to become president, you have to win a majority. And if you don't, then the election goes to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation gets one vote. So basically the smallest state and the largest state have the same influence. This was created in the design of the Constitution. This was the way the framers were trying to protect small states. It had nothing to do with the increment of electoral college votes. This was the way they wanted to do it. But by the 20th century, it was clear to everybody that this was profoundly undemocratic, and by the late 20th century, even more so. I mean, as my bellwether, example, Mitch McConnell even thought that this should be reformed in 1992. But efforts to reform it, by the time we, really throughout the 19th and early 20th century, were failed in general because it was unacceptable to different factions for different reasons to reform this piece of the Electoral College and leave all the other pieces standing. Or at one point they wanted to have, at several points, there was an attempt to get rid of the contingent system or modify it in some more democratic way, but that would work only if the large states agreed to get rid of winner take all. And they were never able to cut a deal. So the complexity of the institution has made change difficult in ways that are not always visible from the outside. But the last comment I want to make, it goes back to other questions that have come up here, is that one of the themes, one of the lessons of the book, the lesson to me, is that things change, political circumstances change, political conditions change. And the views of parties and of individuals have changed over time. The circumstances which fed certain stances changed, so that even though my book is a book about defeats, I see a certain optimism both in the long run and recently energized growth in the faith in democracy. But also in the fact that changing circumstances might permit change. One might look also to the history of women's suffrage, which had numerous failures and seemed to have been knocked out of the box as a reform early in the 20th century. And 10 to 15 years later was the law of the land.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, Alice, thank you. That was fabulous. I mean, I really, I learned a lot, and I already read the book. So hopefully the people who have tuned in will have learned something as well and will want to buy the book. Nell, do you have any concluding remarks?
I do. I mean, first, I'd like to thank both of you for this fascinating conversation, and thanks to all of you out there spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this remarkable book and purchase Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College at harvard.com. I posted the links again to purchase the book and for our donation link second time up on the chat. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Mass, and for me, I'm beaming in from Nashville. Have a good night. Keep reading and stay safe. Thank you. And
no, can I come in for just a second? Can I come in for just a second? I would like to thank you for doing such an effective job this evening. And I'd really like to thank Miles, my old friend, for agreeing to do this and for doing it so splendidly. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to.
You did great. All right.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Have a good evening. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.